you can see just below it, you can weight these things however you want. This is customizable. So we currently have this one weighted. Eligibility is 60%. And you can see in the pie chart, you've got a 60% weighting over there. And then HA suitability is 20%, and the interview suitability is 20%. And that's completely customizable. You could say we want to give more weight to the interview or less weight to the interview, or we want to give more weight to suitability in general or eligibility in general. But it's a decision you make straight out, is how you're going to weight them. Then you have graph down here, and you notice that the interview suitability is blank because that hasn't been entered yet before I ran this report. After I enter the interview results into the system, I can run the report again, and it will include that data as well. So you can see this person is very, very strong in eligibility and not too bad in suitability. So now the system is going to give a breakdown of each one of those components, and it's going to say eligibility and go over each one. This one is for a job, human resource manager. It's just a hypothetical JSF. And these are examples of factors that we might have in the questions, and this will be for the pre-assessment, or it could be for as they come into the interview as well. Example would be, how many years experience do you have working as a full-time human resource manager for a company with over 200 employees? If you notice, we try to get very crisp and clear with the questions. Okay? And then they have many different options to choose from, but in this case, Bob chose 12 to 14 years. Now the real question is, it's not a matter of you just having that information of 12 to 14 years and seeing a bar across that says 14 years that goes from 0 to 20 or whatever. The question is, what is the impact that that's going to have on performance? And that's what the job success formula does for you. And that's why this is what we call an impact graph. Is what that tells us that given the way we've scored this JSF, that this is going to have a substantially positive impact on the overall result. Okay? So if I only give you this information, or I only give the interviewer this information, they're left to their own devices to figure out how does that impact the overall result on each item, which is not that easy to do. Then you've got managed at least 200 employees experience. How many years experience do you have working a full-time job? Were total number of employees below you on the management hierarchy for which you were responsible was at least 200 employees? Again, very crisp, clear question. Okay? And his answer is 12 to 14 years again. Okay? And you notice we've asked another question of managed at least 50 employees, because we still may want to consider people who have only managed 50 employees for this job. So we've crafted a question and we weighted it quite cleverly so that if they have 200, they're going to get more points, and if they have this, they'll get less points, but they're still on the radar. Okay? How many years experience do you have working a full-time job where the total number of employees below you on the management hierarchy for which you're responsible was 50 employees? And he said, well, I've got 15 to 17 years experience. Okay, showing up really strong. Now these factors are what we call interview-only factors. So what we can do with the eligibility is we can have some factors which are pre-assessed and some factors which are assessed during the interview. So you don't have to do them all on the pre-assessment. And the pre-assessment will treat these as null factors. In other words, they won't be considered in the score. But you'll be able to see the results of what they did on these factors. Now usually there's going to be about 10 or so. I'm just giving you this as an example. But usually there's going to be about 10 eligibility factors. In this case, I've marked several of them as interview only, so you can see that possibility. Now we go the highest, we can ask questions like the highest budget responsibility. Indicate the largest size of annual budget you've been responsible for allocating as manager for at least a year. And they chose the range 200,000 to 299,000. Okay, and now we know the impact of these. But the real point is that each one of these things have been thought out in terms of the impact. And I'll show you a job success formula to show you how we do that, and that'll be in the next phase. And then it says, well, how much resource admin experience do you have? And that's treated as part of it as well. In other words, you're not having to juggle all those things in your head. We may say things like human resource industry sector in healthcare. So you may be in a specific industry of healthcare, and you may want to know that, and that may be a factor. And you may also want to be looking at the highest level of degree. You can also look at degree subject as well. And then degree subject, here's one for administration. How many years experience do you have a full-time human resource position where employee counseling was a key element of that position? And that's 9 to 11 years, okay? And so we have the capability of creating what we call a compound factor, and that's what we call an OR factor. So it means in a situation where you could say, well, we want someone who has one type of thing or another type of thing, and it'll take the highest of those two without them losing points if they don't have both. So we can say if you have a degree in human resource administration or a degree in psychology, then we'll consider those both to be useful. And we can even score the degree in human resource administration as stronger than the one in psychology. And then it will take the highest of both of those. And that's what we call an OR factor or a compound factors. And it's that kind of detail that you really need to be able to get a good overall score. Okay? And we have things that can also be bonus factors. That means if they have it, they get points for it. If they don't have it, they really don't lose any points. They get some bonus points. So that's an example of the eligibility. Now we come down to the suitability. Here you can see this is similar to some of you using some of the other reports from the HA6 system. And this is similar to the behavioral impact graph, only now we have a full definition of each. And again, it shows the person's score in relationship to this trait, and it shows the impact of that score on the job. So we're always looking at the impact. Most of the assessments that I see will simply give you the score on a graph. And then it's up to you to figure out what to do with that. Okay? What we want to know, and the most critical piece of information is, how does a 9.8 impact the person's job success potential? Well, the answer is substantially positive. Okay, and you can see we have a whole series of traits. These are all what we call essential traits. That means the more they have of them, the better. So we've got wants challenge, takes initiative, an interest in finance and business, analytical, persistence. Scrolling down, we've got authoritative, that's the willingness to make decisions, strategic judgment. This person scores a 6.1. And what we want to prevent is the interviewer saying, oh, they've only got a 6.1 on strategic judgment, that should kill them off. I don't want to hire that person, right? But what the report says is, no, actually, it's not really that negative. It's not really positive. It's just sort of neutral. It's not the greatest, but it's not going to have a tremendously negative impact on the person's success. Okay. Then we want to know, okay, how much do they have the desire to lead? How much they tend to enlist other people's cooperation. These are all what we call essential factors. Planning, and then we have another one, collaborative, and this one is different. These are what we call desirable traits. Desirable traits are traits that are not core to the job, but if you're missing them, then they can interfere with success. So it doesn't matter in this case, this person absolutely loves collaborating and they tend to be the greatest collaborator. It just means that if they are lacking collaboration, then it will tend to interfere with success. And to get a good behavioral assessment, you have to make that distinction. If you're treating all factors as the more they have, the better, it's creating a lot of fuzz and noise into the assessment. And this creates a very crisp assessment by saying, okay, if they're missing it, they're going to lose some points. And in this case, the person tends to be a bit low in collaboration, and it tells you that there's a slightly negative impact on success for this person. Now, if it were a highly strategic job or a job where there was tremendous collaboration, then this might be scored differently. These are completely adjustable. And you can see we have a whole lot of traits in here. Diplomatic would fall into this area. They don't have to be diplomats, but they do have to be moderately diplomatic. And if they're not, they're going to lose some points. Same with being enthusiastic and clear about their goals, and handling conflict, and helpful, and influencing. If you notice, we put a definition on each one of those, because what we found is when we didn't do that is everybody just sort of makes up their own. Yeah? Okay. That doesn't make for good assessment. Then optimistic, pressure tolerance, self-acceptance. So these are scored so that if they're below a certain point, that they'll tend to lose some points as a result of that. For any job, there's usually about 10 different things that are core to the job that the more you have of it, the better. And there's usually about 25, sometimes even 30 different things that if you're lacking in it or that you happen to have a negative trait, it's going to interfere with success. Most behavioral assessment I see only deals with the first 10 categories, the first 10. It says, okay, these are the things that we think we want. Okay? But it's actually 2/3 to 3/4 of it is what you can do to mess up. Okay? And if you don't measure those things, then your ability to predict is going to go way down. Again, you want to capture the complete picture as much as possible. Okay, and here's what we call the negative traits. We call blindly optimistics. That means when people say, well, what does it mean? Well, it's the tendency to focus on positive benefits of a plan and strategy while failing to adequately see the potential difficulties. Okay? And defensive, well, what's that? The tendency to focus on self-acceptance while avoiding self-improvement. I'm okay and I don't need to improve. And there's a whole series of things, and you can see each one of these things would impact the job, right? From your experience. Okay? You can see that these all make sense. They have face validity in terms of the job. They also have statistical validity, because these JSFs on the suitability side that we create are all based on our performance research. How do we get it? Well, there's two different things. One thing is you look at it and it just simply makes sense. It relates to the job. The other thing is that when we do our research, we measure the high performers and we measure the low performers. And we look at the difference between the high performers and the low performers and look at the traits that then in which there is a difference between the high performers and the low performers. That's the critical event. Doing norms in personality is not successful at all. If you do norms, all you're doing is looking at what the average person is like. Okay? I'm going to do a set of norms, and I'm going to then say, well, the norm of our salespeople is 8.6 on this trait. So what? It really means nothing. Because you don't yet have something that differentiates your high performers from your low performers. So next, people have taken the step and they say, okay, well now I'm going to measure our high performers. Okay, well that's a good step. That's a lot better than just doing norms. I'm going to measure my high performers. And then what they often do is say, I'm going to take those traits that the high performers have and I'm going to build that into a job success formula. Right? It sounds reasonable, right? But it's not. Because the low performers may have some of those traits as well. And so what you really need to do is you need to analyze what's the difference between the high performers and the low performers. What distinguishes high performance in this job? That is the only way you can get a good suitability formula. And it's also the only way you can determine the things that are going to interfere with success. Because as I just said, it's about 2/3, sometimes 3/4 of what goes into a behavioral formula. The things that will interfere with success are critical. And if you're only looking at what your high performers are and what scores they have high, you'll miss the entire 2/3 to 3/4 of what that's going to be. So you need a really deep analysis of what are the traits that make people successful and what are the traits that are interfering with success for the poorer performers. Okay? Once you've got that, now you've got a real handle on it. And we've collected that research over the last 20 years, and it's basically all in the system. And it's categorized into different job functions that tell you what makes people successful for those different job functions, so that you have a basis to start with when you use the suitability assessment, which is critical to the result. You know, I asked this one person, he says, using a certain assessment, and I said, well, you know, how do you determine which traits are, you know, the right traits to success or not? And he said, well, actually, each of our interviewers, they like different traits, and they pick based on the traits that they like, because, you know, that's the ones that really works for them, right? So, in other words, you've gone back to saying, how much do I like that person or not? Which gives you about a 0.1 correlation, which makes the assessment almost useless. It maybe helps a little bit because it facilitates the interview process maybe, but not much value there. Okay. So when we look through, you can see we've got a whole lot of potential negative traits there. On the eligibility portion, you've got, these are the questions that you've set up to ask, how many years of experience, these are the answers, and when you go into the interview, this is the interview assessment, you can then rescore these and enter that information back into the system, and the system will rescore the results, and you can regenerate the reports, and it'll then give a different score. So here's a full list of the eligibility questions. And we also have behavioral interviewing questions that are attached to each trait that you think is important. These are also customizable. You can say, now I like a little different question for takes initiative, and you can customize it. And then what it does then is prompt your interviewers to ask that question, so that then you can have a second shot at trying to evaluate their initiative. Because as I said earlier, you want to go into more depth on a lot of those things to try and really discover, you know, well, where was that experience with initiative? Okay? And one's challenge, same. It's another good example. Especially for those critical motivational factors, it's very important to go deep. And what we call the essential factors, the more you have, the better. It's very important to go deeply on those things so that you can then suss them out a little bit better. And here's our sample of the How to Attract report. You can see this is identifying what Bob is really, you know, focused on. This one says, Bob has an extremely optimistic and cheerful attitude. Bob will be more attracted to your company if he or she believes that the management, especially his or her supervisor, also has a positive and optimistic outlook. Okay? So you're going to put this person under a supervisor. If that person's got a really positive outlook, you know, it's a great thing to communicate to the person that's going into the job. Think it from their point of view. They're getting married practically to their supervisor, and they don't really even know who they are. So if you can describe how, you know, some of that may fit, it's a very useful thing to make the person attractive to the job. And it gives you a whole series of hints, basically. And these hints are ordered in terms of being the most important. So when this says Bob is extremely optimistic, that says that's one of their highest values, is optimism. And they are not going to be around a person with a pessimistic attitude. And so, you know, and they may have already had experience, you know, in jobs where they're around somebody with a pessimistic attitude, you know, a manager or whatever. And so just by knowing that and being able to respond to that in some kind of an interview situation can be extremely helpful. Okay? Another one, Bob is highly motivated by opportunities to take initiative. To attract Bob to your company, specify the areas in which he or she will be able to take initiative. Okay? Now that spells it out to the person, look, you'll be able to do this, this, and this, and this. How great is that? You know, the person says, okay, well now at least I'm dealing with a company that really is looking at my needs, okay, and is really identifying how they can meet my needs as well as me meeting their needs. That already has a tremendously positive effect, you know, just during the interview process.